these live on our
This
website.
meeting is being recorded.
This will appear on our website after the event, so folks can check in that couldn't make it today. So welcome, everybody. My name is Pete Harrison. I'm the director of Desegregate Connecticut. We are a pro-homes coalition of neighborhood groups and nonprofits dedicated to a more sustainable and equitable Connecticut. We focus on land use reform and how thinking more about the built environment, thinking smart about it, can help solve a lot of the problems that we have in Connecticut on racial justice, on economic inequality, and climate resiliency. As many of you know, we are a coalition of over 80 groups. Oops, let me get to the slide, I apologize. We are a coalition of over 80 groups and growing. Very excited about the diversity of geographies and issue-based folks that are committed to this work. And if you're interested in joining our coalition, please do reach out to me at pete@desegregatect.org. We're always interested talking to folks on the ground in communities, doing the work and interested in learning more. So the title of our program today, oh, and actually apologize, we have two programming notes. First, our third panelist had a conflict arise and couldn't participate, so we apologize about that. And second, I have an 8-week-old baby that I will be somewhat in charge of starting at 12:30, so I may have to be on mute and jump back and forth a little bit, making sure he goes down. So this heads up about that, but thank you for being flexible there. So the title of this event is Derailed, Delayed, Not Derailed. And this is a little bit of a post-session discussion about where we stand with our core proposal this year, which was transit-oriented communities, which, as I'm sure everyone knows, unfortunately did not get passed into law this year. We learned a lot of good things as a coalition and built up a lot of strong support for it. And we also, I think, learned some things about how we can improve this piece of legislation and our coalition efforts going into next year's session. So I want to talk a little bit about that at the top of the hour here. Then I want to get some perspectives from some of our great coalition members who are here today to talk about some of the things that we've learned and next steps that we should take as we think about the policy and the people that we are working on here. So very quick, broad overview. What are transit-oriented communities? Very simply, it's a small area of slightly higher density with mixed-use development, including diverse housing options. They are naturally focused around an existing fixed transit station, be it a CT fast track rapid bus or a CT rail station. There are 62 stations across the state that fall into this category. And the TOC is a half-mile radius, which is typically a 10-minute walk of development areas around 500 acres around that transit area. So the idea here is, how can we have more homes and more kinds of homes within this half-mile landscape to encourage folks to get out of their cars, to encourage more housing diversity, both from affordability and from demographics? And how can we, at the local level and at the state level, encourage these kinds of developments? And we'll talk about both of those strategies going forward. We put together a great report that lives on our website. I think Catherine can share it in the chat at some point too, to give some more context about what TOC opportunities exist in Connecticut. As I mentioned, we have 62 stations across 40 communities, not just the Metro North line in New Haven, but we've got some branch lines, the Hartford line, Shoreline East, and the CT fast track between New Breton and New Haven, or Hartford, which gives an immense amount of opportunity to build an immense amount of homes and diverse kinds of homes across the state for all kinds of communities. So I encourage all of you, I'm sure a lot of folks read this when it came out and during the legislative session, but this is all data from our zoning atlas and very relevant to the conversations we're having at the local level and at the state level. So very quickly, just to give a recap for folks about kind of what happened at the state level with our legislative strategy. We were very excited to get our bill for transit-oriented community development raised with the name HB 5429. The basic outline of the policy, we came together as a coalition around this time last year to discuss what we wanted to propose. Our proposal was based very closely on what passed in Massachusetts last year with the bipartisan support. So we thought that was a really good place to start for this legislative session. And the basic outlines of that was within the half-mile radius and 10-minute walk of an existing transit station, we would encourage a baseline of 15 homes per acre, 10% of those being deed restricted affordable, no onerous parking requirements, common sense carve outs for environmental sensitive land, historic preservation was also a part of that. So the idea here was giving a baseline of action at the state level that communities could then turn around and figure out how to make them work at the local level. One of the other components of it was a town that had multiple stations could in fact option to focus development on one station instead of the other stations. So we felt that going into the legislative session, we had a really good sense of what was politically feasible, what made sense from a policy standpoint of balancing our state interests and also our local interests. So we, as a coalition, were very excited about that. This was 2 examples that one of our architecture fellows put together what 15 homes per acre really looks like. And I think these were very effective tools for us. Oftentimes around these issues, there's a vacuum in the imagination of folks of, are we talking about skyscrapers? Are we talking about all kinds of things? So we created a number of these assets, visual assets, to show what the different parameters around 15 homes per acre could look like. It could mean an apartment building with some open space. It could mean a mixture of duplexes and townhomes. All of the alike were really part of our legislative effort and education effort. So as I talked about already, of course, unfortunately, we did not see the legislation pass. We were very excited to get the issue raised. We had a great public hearing. There was, of course, some challenges that we knew going into it that played a role in where we were. The way the Connecticut legislature works, the election years are short sessions, which means very practically that it's harder to get issues raised in a committee to get into a public hearing than to get actually onto the floor and pass. On this cycle, bills can only be raised by sitting committee chairs, as opposed to the off-election cycle, which is a longer session, which allows any member, elected member, to raise an issue. So we knew there was a narrower path to getting the issue raised. We were very excited to do so. But once we got to the hearing, there was an interesting mix of folks that opposed the bill. Some, I think, had good faith concerns about the impact on the development side. Many had bad faith concerns that were sort of the classic anti-homes NIMBYist arguments about just kind of not wanting any kind of change. And they used sort of different arguments over that. So I think one of the other things that we recognized as well was that there was a misconception about as of right development, which was really in the language of the bill, versus community input. I think some of the opponents were able to confuse folks and sort of make it appear that our proposal effectively sidelined local planning and zoning commissions and community input. But actually, in fact, quite the opposite was the case. The idea of as of right development really just means the input comes from the community at the project, at the kind of macro level and the onset, as opposed to how the process works now, which is kind of at the individual project by project level. So as of right development, strangely enough, became more of a talking point than we'd anticipated. So that all kind of merged together, that even though we had very strong support and champions at the legislative session, within the short session, within a time crunch, the clock became the biggest obstacle to us. So we were not able to kind of get the support to get on the floor. What I can say about that is, on the good side, the policy is popular. The policy is well understood by legislators, and it really was more of an issue of the clock working against us. So that makes us very confident in this longer session going forward, with some feedback from coalition members, as we're doing today and elsewhere. We can come back and get this done at the state level. So even though we're certainly disappointed that in the short session we didn't get it, that was not out of the realm of possibilities. We laid a lot of great groundwork at the local level and at the state level to get this done. So we are very much excited to come back next year with a even better proposal and a stronger coalition to get this done. And part of the process over the summer is having these discussions as we're having today to get feedback about what we learned, how we can improve the policy, how we can improve who we're talking to about it, who we're talking on behalf of for the policy. So with that, I will start by introducing our first speaker, who will talk a little bit about the policy side of things. Doug House-Ledden serves as the executive director of the New Haven Parking Authority. He manages over $20 million in revenues earned by over 8,500 off-street parking spaces, including 18 surface lots and 6 parking structures, including at New Haven's historic Union Station. He will be taking over management of State Street Station in July. He also serves as a member of the Connecticut Commuter Rail Council. He comes from the public sector with a transportation and real estate background, with professional experience in public health, real estate, elected office, and entrepreneurship. And we had a chance to talk a little bit earlier, and Doug's really going to give us some good ideas of what other pieces of the puzzle on the policy side as we navigate the local level and at the state level, and things to keep in mind as we're thinking about coming back at the state level. So with that, let me turn it over to Doug for a short presentation.
Thanks so much, Pete, and thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to speak today. As mentioned, I'm the executive director for the New Haven Parking Authority. If you do need parking options when you come to town, or if you're taking the train, we'll be able to greet each other, and we're at parknewhaven.com. We have over 45 electric vehicle charging stations in our portfolio, and we're building 40 more this year. And additionally, as Pete mentioned, we manage Union Station Transportation Center, which right now, if you ever need to figure out if there's parking available, you can go to our website. Presently, there's 64% of our parking is available. It's important for me to recognize that we're having this conversation in a time of COVID and post-COVID. I wanted to share a blog post about our electric vehicle charging if you want to go to the EV Club of Connecticut. But we're having this conversation post-COVID when commuting patterns are changing, and I think the most important thing that in the transportation space is we realize as transportation professionals that outside air and freedom of mobility is extremely important during COVID. We're going to talk a little bit about areas within a half mile of train stations, and I'm not going to leave New Haven out. I'm going to focus my efforts on the work we do here in New Haven. This is a planning study called the Wooster Square State Street TOD planning study, and I'm trying to, if anybody knows pizza in Connecticut, or heck, if anybody knows pizza in the world, you'll be familiar with Wooster Street right here. So Sally's, Pepe's, just to ground us into there's even a Body's sneaks in there as well. But very close to Wooster Street is a rail line, and as well, a lot of barriers from which people are trying to walk to the train station. Wooster Square has over 15% of the population walking to work. It's our #1 walk to work neighborhood. But as you can see, there's some real barriers here that include the train line. And if you broaden the scope a little bit and take a look at this planning document, which I'll link in the chat in a moment, you'll also notice that there are barriers, of course, with 91, 95. And you see these red dots over here with some making it a little tougher to walk from Union Station, if you can see my cursor right now. So really what we're going to talk a little bit about today is, what's going on around our train stations in Connecticut. And again, I'll focus on my backyard and the work we're doing here. You can see Water Street. Water Street's on the bottom of our screen. Again, just to center you, Wooster Square. Wooster Street is right here. You can see the square to kind of get your bearings. This blue line down here is Water Street. And as you can kind of tell from Water Street, it's a 4-lane effective highway with sidewalks that don't always connect. It's exciting to see out there today. The Farmington Canal line is being constructed, and we're working on building the streetscape to actually be able to walk along Water Street the entire way. All over Connecticut, we're finding that within a 10-minute walk of train stations, it's not possible to walk to the train. And the best way to have what we've been working on at the Connecticut Commuter Rail Council and talking about a lot is, the best way to have transit customers is to build housing near transit and to have homegrown transportation advocates, but also users. For a transportation-oriented community, a transit-oriented community, you need transit. And so we'll talk a little bit about how do we get transit on track, pardon the pun, or get the bus rolling a little bit more. As mentioned by Pete in the introduction, Connecticut Fast Track is one of the high frequency services that are provided by the Connecticut DOT in Connecticut. It's an award-winning bus rapid transit line with dedicated right-of-way. It's effectively a train on wheels, is one way to think about it. We'll talk a little bit about how we can spread this benefit of bus rapid transit into other communities. New Haven is excited to be a focus of the Connecticut DOT Transit Division with the Move New Haven study available at movenewhaven.com. Move New Haven talks a lot about how to get our CT Transit New Haven system improved even more. Some elements, bus rapid transit lines that are going to be connecting our 212 and 234, Grand Avenue in the east, Dixwell Avenue in the north, Congress or Columbus Avenue to the south, and Whaley Avenue to the west, with a bus rapid transit system that really helps enhance our service, not only to the train stations, especially State Street, but also to so many parts of our community that people need to get to every day of the week. Other elements of getting our transit on the right track, again, the four-wheel transit, having the mobility hubs and transit hubs where customers are welcome to sit and wait. I think one of the better examples of this is at Hartford Union Station, having the bus rapid transit fast track paired with our Hartford line and the Vermonter service at Union Station, but also at Bridgeport Station, where the Greater Bridgeport Transit District runs the train station there, and you can hop right off the train and get onto the bus. I know over 7,000 Housatonic Community College students use that system every day. So in New Haven, we have a lot of neighborhoods, and we have a lot of communities around the state. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the commercial corridor zoning effort that happened a couple years back. And I'll link this into the webpage. But the commercial corridors was really an attempt with 3 commercial corridors, 3 of which that are on this BRT proposal: Dixwell, Grand Avenue, and Whaley Avenue. And working through our Board of Alders and with our community, working to densify and provide additional tax revenues, additional customers for retail, and additional people for our community. So some of the ways and elements that we worked with this in the local effort at the New Haven commercial corridors was we gave a density bonus for proximity to a transit hub. And really what we're talking about there is bus stops. And we're proposing future bus rapid transit line stops on Whaley Avenue. 2 of them will have this upzoning opportunity. And really more could happen as well, with the frequency of service being the key, the frequency and reliability of service. Also, as we've been finding out over the last 50 years, there's not room for everything. And if you make room for parking and surface parking at that especially, you lose a lot of other benefits in the community. We'll talk a little bit about some taxable revenues, so for property taxes and up and down the Northeast corridor. But some of the greatest benefits in the Whaley Avenue rezoning was parking maximums were set for all properties in Whaley, locating the parking behind buildings, trying to get the properties to the property line to make a much more walkable, dense community. Some of the work we have to do is just make it more fun to walk and make it more enjoyable to walk and incentivize people to do so. Step 1 is having sidewalks. Step 2 is having safe crossings and the like. There's other things that we can all do as a community together, which can be part governmental, part business, or part NGO, or part nonprofit. So in the benefits of the zoning update that we did for Whaley Avenue, and again, I'll link the Whaley Avenue site in the chat, trying to right-size the parking requirements, again, requiring affordable housing, which in New Haven, we have the most affordable housing, I think, in the state. I could be wrong. It's definitely most in the region, but we still have a gap of thousands of affordable units for the residents of New Haven. And we know that because of our waiting list for affordable housing. So I was on the transportation side here. So giving up zoning and reducing any parking requirements were some of the benefits that we found the property owners can now take advantage of, so that we can get more than auto-dependent use on Whaley Avenue. We were privileged at the Parking Authority to participate in a small little class at the Yale School of the Environment that gave their final presentation just the other day. And they were looking at making a more resilient rail corridor, mostly focusing on the New Haven line and a little bit on one of the branch lines. So they looked at a lot of data and a lot of information, like 155,000 people are employed in the walk shed. We're calling a walk shed not the half-mile radius, but a 0.75-mile route, an actual route that you would walk after you get off the train. So 155,000 jobs are within that 0.75 miles, but only 15,000 people live in that same walk shed. Here in New Haven, we're working hard. There's over 2,000 units under construction right now within a half mile of State Street Station and Union Station. But we got to do more, and we can do more. And the benefit of doing more and bringing residents back to Connecticut, back to our cities, and back to our transit centers, our TOCs, will have innumerable benefits, including but not limited to property tax values for the local community, and of course, income tax for the state of Connecticut as we grow. It's a little wonky of a chart. This is, if you're familiar with the planning world, there's this new way of measuring appraised value per acre and showing it by height of the bar. So you're seeing the denser, the darker color of purple being the most valuable. And this is an analysis of, you can see Route 1. We'll talk about Route 1 in a little bit, maybe, if we get there. But the rail line here, you can see the Northeast Corridor, and you see Stamford, and you see Bridgeport. You see a lot of spiky buildings in Bridgeport. You see more even covered in Stamford. And you see in New Haven as well, you see some good spikes there as well for taxable revenue. But when you go down to Walkshed, you see a lot fewer buildings, and you see a lot fewer opportunities to actually have that walkable environment, so you can actually take the train to a station and get out. And you can see all of the stations that are marked here in the black circles. And any station that does not have any purple around it is an opportunity for the state of Connecticut and the communities that are there. Sure, we're not going to necessarily have a 30-story tower like 360 State Street to have 550 units in one building, 10% affordable, over 55 affordable units right across from the State Street train station, which also has not to do a big plug, but it also has a grocery store and 500-car parking lot. But other ways that we can get there is by focusing on our rail corridors. So this is a Route 1 bus rapid transit feasibility study that was completed in 2017. And really looking at how do we generate a similar style development pattern, but possibly a smaller or more transitional around Route 1, and a focus on Route 1. So, here is a map from this study. Again, I'll link in the chat because I'm just kind of cycling through a bunch of web pages here. And I'm hopeful my friend Sheila will talk a little bit about Route 1 in her side of the state of Connecticut. But you can see here, to go from New York border to New Haven, you have something like 6 or 7 different connections. And there is opportunity to switch from bus to train and back and forth in a number of these locations. And here's the population density around the same line. We have this opportunity with the frequency of service to create something special, a new BRT for not just for New Haven, but all of Connecticut. My dreams, and if I had a wand, I would create this fantastical bus rapid transit system on Route 1 through the entire state of Connecticut, especially from New York to the New Haven County. And I would connect all of the sidewalks and make it handicap accessible. So over at Union Station, New Haven, the Union Station Partnership is a 55-year agreement between the city of New Haven and the state of Connecticut. The New Haven Parking Authority is scheduled to be a contractor for the city of New Haven to help implement the the vision of New Haven and the state of Connecticut at Union Station. So it's at unionstationnewhaven.com. You can sign up, enter your email. You can also watch our developer forum from January 25th. Pretty soon we'll have information about our June 7th final wrap-up forum for the RFI period that we're in right now for redevelopment of Union Station. We're about to launch a website where people can ask questions and get their questions answered with regards to the upcoming development. And I got about 2 more minutes, Pete, and I'll pass it back to you. But so we have an upcoming event as well, June 7th, that'll wrap up, and we're going to be hosting this webpage to solicit feedback from everyone and hear your questions. Here's some of the things we need to do around our train stations in Connecticut. We need to build things. We have to remove surface parking lots and put much more beneficial, buildings in its place. Right now, this image is a massing study. If anybody knows architecture, you'll know it better than I do, but it's simply just a measure to figure out, what is possible on the east end. And that's the east end surface parking lot. So for us at Park New Haven, we're excited to be helping the state of Connecticut and the city of New Haven realize their vision for this station and the campus at Union Station. Right now, this is a 470 car parking lot, but we're hoping to find something much more valuable, much more supportive of the transit that's next to it. I'll kind of wrap up with just one more broad conversation. Oops, it's going to take me a second to find that. So we'll do that in the Q&A, but I'll say that, a lot of our communities have been ripped up by urban renewal. And, we're not immune to it in New Haven, and I did find it real fast. So let me share really quickly, but this is New Haven in the 1960s and 70s, and people thought this was a success to uproot Oak Street neighborhood, tear down all of the buildings. This is the only, on the bottom right corner of the picture is the Gateway building. It's at 54 Meadow Street. It's the only building that survived redevelopment. Over here on the far left is the SNET building at 300 George Street, which now has dozens of biotech pharmaceutical companies that have generated millions in income taxes. So we have to do a lot. There's a conversation happening in Hartford right now on the Along the Lines podcast regarding urban renewal and what cities have, what scars we have to rebuild. I'm really proud of the work that New Haven's doing over the last 15 years since I've lived here. We've been able to, really focus on restitching our neighborhood, the Hill neighborhood with the downtown neighborhood. And I'll just show two more slides if I can. One from the opposite angle to show the highway. So this is one of our structures that we manage, a 2,000 car parking lot called Air Rights Garage. It's called Air Rights because it's built on top of a former highway, Air Rights, the air rights to a highway. We call it the spaceship because it's so large and massive. It also generates a lot of revenues. It also costs a lot to maintain. Other aspects of this image that I want to show is the fact that Orange Street, which is down here, Orange Street is not connecting at the moment. Temple Street was disconnected at the moment. And we have these visions of restitching back our communities. And this takes tens of years and millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And so if your community's experiencing some of these issues, you got to start now, because we just reopened Orange Street connection the first time in 60 years. Traffic has driven over there. We're now working on the phase 4 as a community to build the Temple Street crossing. But these are the kind of things where we actually have to be able to walk around our transit centers. And part of that is going to be physical infrastructure. Some of that is going to be programmatic. And a lot of it is going to take all of us working together. So I just want to thank you for the opportunity to kind of to introduce myself and introduce the work we do at Park New Haven. And I'm excited to do the Q&A in a little bit.
Yeah, thanks so much, Doug. And you really provided a lot of different ideas and projects that are ongoing at the local level and the state level. And I think your key point about if you want transit riders, we need to build homes near transit really is the core idea that we are all really trying to promote here, whether it's one of the larger cities like New Haven or kind of a smaller place. But definitely have some interesting questions coming up in the Q&A. And certainly we'll have time for other questions as well. But I want to transition over to Sheila, who actually I think can give some good perspective on other part of the state in the kind of the New London area that has some different opportunities and challenges presented by TOCs or the lack thereof. So I'll give a quick introduction here and then I'll turn it over. Sorry, let me pull it up here. Sheila Hayes is the president of the NAACP Norwich branch. She has been an active member of the organization for over 30 years, during which she has served 2 terms as president, served on the education subcommittee, organized dozens of events ranging from the annual Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Luncheon and marched to voter registration drives, and has been particularly vocal in the eastern part of Connecticut about transit-oriented communities and getting the kinds of people, younger folks, older folks, people of color, workers to jobs that don't have a lot of options in that part of the state, really trying to center those voices in this advocacy work over that time. So with that, I want to turn it over to Sheila and give your perspective on where we are with TOCs and what we need to get done both in Eastern Connecticut and across the state.
I thank you, Peter, and I thank everyone for attending. So I want to really start by focusing on the affordable housing and about how that creates an inclusive economy. Because having an inclusive economy means everyone can contribute with fair access to resources and opportunity. All right. To start a to put some context around affordable housing and what affordability is in the state, I want to reference the 2020 ALICE report, which stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed, because that's been one of the conversations that I think has been missing, is that when we talk about affordable and affordability, is that we're talking about people who are employed, people who are working. They tend to have this conversation around, well, Sheila, these people aren't working, they're receiving state assistance or whatever. Some of them may be receiving supplemental assistance or some assistance from the state, like for childcare and housing subsidy, but we often lose the fact that these are people who are working, providing services in normally low wage jobs, but they are providing services to us in the state of Connecticut. So according to the report that was issued in 2020, Connecticut saw an economic growth between 2010 and 2018, and yet in 2018, over 1.3 million households still struggled to make ends meet. 11% of these households were living below the federal poverty line level, and another 27% were ALICE households, meaning they earned income above the federal poverty level, but not enough to afford basic household necessities. All right. Also, the report references that across the 8 counties in the state, that the range was for ALICE and poverty households, poverty level households, our range is 29% to 43%. And these are people who cannot afford the housing, the basic needs, transportation, technology, childcare. They are just basically making ends meet, and normally, and a lot of times, these are the individuals who are working full-time jobs and part-time jobs just to create the basic and necessities for their families. Now, that report was based on the 2020, and if you fast forward to 2022, we know with inflation, everything is rising. I'm like you, we go to the grocery store, food is rising, transportation, the cost of gasoline is rising, home heating is rising, as well as the cost of rent. So these are all factors that when we talk about what's affordable in this state, that we need to be mindful of, and I really believe we need to make that at the forefront so people understand that these are basically people who are working, they're providing services, but they need assistance. They need to have rent controlled, affordable housing designated, so they can afford just to live here, especially in some of our communities in southeastern Connecticut. On the issue of the affordable housing piece, drilling down into southeastern Connecticut, and I want to highlight 2 communities. They're both transit-oriented communities. They're both on the shoreline. They're both on, Doug wanted me to talk about Route 1. They both are on that Route 1 corridor. And one is New London, which is more of an urban center. And then outside of New London, that's not too many miles away, is Stonington, about 10, 15 miles away. From New London sits the borough of Stonington. And back in 2021, the state passed and enacted Public Act 21-29, which talks about affordable housing plans. So the communities who did not have an affordable housing plan, they needed to prepare one. And then their communities who have a housing plan, they needed to amend and update the plans. So what do our current laws say around affordable housing? When communities have less than 10% affordable housing, developers do not have to conform to zoning regulations when they submit projects that have 30% of the units considered affordable. And this is part of a larger conversation that is happening here in Eastern Connecticut and probably across the state. So I want to drill down and give you a comparison of how New London is handling their affordable housing plan in Stonington. And this is information I received out of the day as was reported basically within the past couple of weeks. New London currently has about 20% of affordable housing units, and they are looking for ways to actually provide more affordable housing units because they're seeing this as an opportunity with housing boom, with new construction, with increase in jobs. Electric Boat is indicated they plan on hiring another 5,000 to 6,000 people over the next couple of years. So they see it as an opportunity to even take the availability of construction and new housing to create more affordable housing. Okay. Currently in New London, household incomes are increasing in New London, even as home prices and rents continue to rise. And according to the finding that was, they had a study with their affordable housing, they found that 52% of renter households are cost burdened or spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs, leaving less money for necessities such as food, transportation, education, healthcare, and childcare. More than 60% of the houses in the city rent as opposed to owning their homes. So when you talk about the importance, and New London is a walkable city, it's a transit-oriented city, it has rail, it has bus, it has water taxis as well, that having the affordable and creating more affordable housing in their city is actually an opportunity to help take the cost burden off of the renters and homeowners to reduce their transportation costs as well as other additional costs. I want to move over to Stonington, and Stonington currently has about 6% of affordable housing. Vast difference between New London and Stonington. Their median family household income is $79,250. They actually had a study, and they actually had 33 pages of recommendations in the study. But what happened is there was a public hearing held in April, and the residents came out and they raised concerns to the commission, and the commission cut out a lot of the recommendations and reduced it down to 5 pages to look at to be implemented, recommended for their housing plan. And I want to talk about some of the changes that were recommended that they took out, because they sound a lot of what we in Desegregate Connecticut have been looking for in other organizations across the state, what we want to see legislators address when it comes to zoning, and what we want municipalities to address. So among some of the changes that had been recommended in the plan, it was to consider reducing the 2,000 square foot minimum requirement for building size to have an accessory apartment in an effort to allow such dwellings in smaller homes. Consider allowing duplexes on the same minimum lot size as single family homes where duplexes are allowed, and allowing multifamily uses in residential districts served by adequate public, sewer, and water or wells and septic systems, and also in commercial districts. So what came out of the commissioner's recommendation? What are they recommending as their affordable housing plan? They are recommending that the creation of an affordable housing commission to study the two proposals as well as a property tax abatement policy. And that is what we see often over and over again across municipalities that really don't want to address and implement true affordable housing and transit orientated districts within their communities. They come up and tell us we want another study. We need to create another study to study the study. So that's a disappointment. We're hoping that Stonington will, and the residents, and we can work with them throughout the community over the next several years, should they adopt the commission's recommendation, that we can work with them to address some of the real issues and drill down into what would really make their community a viable, living, affordable community for people who are working and providing services in this area. I just briefly want to touch upon the other challenge is the environmental and social justice issue, climate justice, and just that I don't want to lose sight that environmental and climate justice is a civil rights issue. It may not sound like it is, but we are very concerned at the NAACP from our national office all the way down to our state and local levels. We want people to understand environmental injustice is about people who have died and others who are chronically ill because of exposure to toxins. Climate change is the new normal for severe storms, like Hurricane Sandy and Isaac, which devastated communities from Boston to Biloxi. So what are we working on to address the climate change and the injustices in our environment? We are fighting for policies to rectify these impacts and advance a society that fosters sustainable, cooperative, regenerative communities that uphold all rights for all people in harmony with Earth. We are fighting to strengthen community resilience and livability to ensure that communities are equipped to engage in sustainability in climate action planning that integrates policies and practices on advancing food justices, advocating for transportation equity, upholding civil and human rights in emergency management, and facilitating participatory democracy. Thank you. Peter, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. I mean, that was just, a great dive into some of the contrasts between a city like New London that sees the opportunity of being a transit-oriented community and sees the opportunity at building more housing, will attract younger people, attract all these workers for electric boat, contrasting that, unfortunately, with Stonington that has a transit station, is connected to this larger fabric, and so far, at least a few residents, I think you said the residents, I think it's always a small amount of residents came out against that bill. But that gets to my kind of first question to you, Sheila. And not that everything in New London is perfect. There are obviously some concerns about some of the housing being built by the station that's expensive. But they get it in the sense of this is a huge opportunity, particularly for folks across the spectrum economically. You mentioned the Alice designated folks. A lot of them do not have cars or cannot afford cars. And the idea of having walkable access to public transportation is a key opportunity for a city like New London to attract new people and to attract new dynamism. So what, in your experience, can you say to somebody like a Stonington, at least those minority of residents that oppose this plan, why don't they get it versus why do the folks in New London broadly get it? And how do we get those Stonington homeowners to get it?
Right. So I'm going to say that even here in Norwich and in the region, we keep mixing up what is affordable housing and what's affordability. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to lay out, what the Alice what Alice stands for, because there's this mindset as soon as we say we want to increase affordable housing and we want developers to be able to come in and provide, deed restricted affordable housing that we know is going to be there. They're like, you want us to take and you want us to take the people who don't live in our community. And we're saying that's not true. There are people that live in your community who are struggling because they cannot meet the basic needs, and yet they're providing, they're the ones doing your home health care. They're the ones working in service orientated jobs. They're the ones working in some of our medical facilities, doing home health outreach. These are the people who live in your community, and that, they tend to think that we're talking about bringing in outsiders. And I believe that's the conversation to have with them, that they have to understand first, just let's talk about take care of your own people and really dig down and find out how many of your people fall under the ALICE, how many of them are asset limited income employed. And then how can they benefit if you were to reduce some of your zoning regulations, if you were to allow some of this alternative type housing and then have it near your transit systems, that it would help really increase the opportunities for everyone that lives in southeastern Connecticut.
Yeah, that's just a phenomenal point, Sheila. The idea that this isn't for, as much as we talk about future residents and younger folks coming back, there's a real need in communities right now, and shifting that narrative at that local level to say there are people that live in your town right now that need these kinds of resources and this kind of housing around transit is a really key thing. That actually brings me back to you, Doug, and this transition of how do we talk about these kinds of riders? How do we encourage more kinds of riders? You talked about, post-COVID, we're not going to get 40 million commuters between New Haven and Grand Central. That's just not coming back. What potentially could come back is with other transit investments, this kind of intra-state, intra-community commuter or worker or students. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I mean, how do you see that narrative forming as well? How do we get legislators, particularly at the state level, out of this mindset that we're talking about white collar commuters going to New York, when we're really talking about a wider, more attractive opportunity for people in Connecticut?
Thanks so much, Pete. And I'll start with this, the city of New Haven, and over 30% of households in New Haven do not have a car, which is probably greater than 30% of the population based on the households that are in that set. And we really do need to focus on getting people to work or getting around our communities. I think in our pre-meeting, Sheila hit me on the side of the head and said, I had to take the bus. I could walk everywhere, but I had to take the bus to the grocery store. About a decade ago, the Greater New Haven NAACP put forth a very important pivotal report called How Transportation Problems Keep People Out of the Workforce in Greater New Haven. And it's something that it's a report I read frequently just to refresh my memory on what is being drilled in as far as what the government can do differently. One of the things about our state being unaffordable is almost the bare requirement of having a vehicle. Vehicles cost $7,000 to $10,000 per year to operate, and our lower income folks in New Haven just obviously have fewer vehicles. And for us here in New Haven, this is very important. We, as mentioned by Sheila, urban health, the health of our city, the health of our residents in the Hill neighborhood, in New Hallville, in all of our neighborhoods, it was really discussed by again, a pivotal report called Urban Apartheid in the Greater New Haven NAACP. And, thinking through of how do we remove the barriers to healthy neighborhoods? We've been working in a triennial health survey that now is statewide, but powered by the Connecticut Data Haven, and thinking through, trying to figure out in one neighborhood versus the other. Let me just go zoom in for you. in one neighborhood versus the other, what are the key social determinants of health and what do we need to work on? So I won't get too wonky to say that, some of it is pretty obvious. We have to be able to get people to work, get people to bus lines. They have to be able to walk there. So some of the things we're doing here in New Haven are big projects like the Farmington Canal line. This is an underground portion of the Farmington Canal that will take folks in Newhallville and pop them up in downtown. But we're doing other smaller things too, like curb extensions with paint and delineator sticks, things that are temporary, tactical, trying to get people to think about taking a walk to their bus. With that, I'll pass it back to you, Pete, and say I'm excited to keep the conversation going. Trying to figure out, how do we start getting legislators to think about us as residents? Obviously, we call them and let them know how we feel and what we experience every day. There's about 3 million of us, and a lot of us in our cities are still having, even though we have exceptional bus coverage or transit access, we're still having a tough time getting the service we need. So I'll say one thing or two things and put it right back to you, which is, transit-oriented communities, or TOD, transit-oriented development, it really needs a DOT, development-oriented transit. And the Waterbury branch is a perfect example of this. The Waterbury line had a large drop in service being proposed. But thanks to the efforts of the Connecticut Commuter Rail Council, Jim Gilday, our chair, and all of the elected representatives along the line, and also the advocates and riders along the line, the DOT heard them, and they're increasing that service. And the service is going to look pretty good as far as a branch line is concerned. And what that means for the residents along the Waterbury line is many, many more points of access to the rest of the state without a car. So we need TOCs, but we also need that DOT, the development-oriented transit that has the service frequencies to really generate the ridership that really helps support the ongoing use of the system.
Yeah, and for folks listening in on this, we're going to have increasing conversations, certainly with CT Rail Council and others, about how we advocate more for transit ridership and more service. It's exciting with some of the BID funding from the federal government, and also the state's made lots of investments in some of these systems already. So the interest is there and the infrastructure is there in many cases. So there are lots of future conversations we'll have about this. I want to get to a couple of questions we had in the last few minutes here. Somebody had asked about the role of public housing in this conversation. And I want to ask you, Sheila, you talked about alternative housing and some of the housing zoning requirement changes that we've talked about. But one of the elements here is housing is incredibly expensive to build. And that makes it really hard without a certain level of state subsidy to get to that level for ALICE individuals. You also talked about the inflationary cycle that we're in, how long that looks like. But just very quickly, what are the ideas? Would you like to see the state actually get into investing directly in housing construction on public owned land? There's a lot of publicly owned land around transit in our state. Would you like to see that potentially?
Yes. The Department of Housing, Department of Housing Finance Authority, HUD, all of those, don't forget the federal government. They, HUD can come in and also help with creating affordable housing, whether it's home ownership, and especially, let's talk about the home ownership. They can provide some of the financing as well as the state, and local authorities need to also think about how do you create opportunities for people who are on the lower end scale, and working class people who need some kind of assistance or some kind of especially with interest rates rising again, some type of interest-free money for a set period of time. And look at it as if you have the working partnership together, you're increasing your tax base. I don't know why why communities don't understand, especially with home ownership, that as soon as if you can build, and I like Doug's picture that he had, that he showed what happens when you can put more buildings, more housing, affordable housing in a denser area, you're gaining tax revenue. What don't say, I mean, we're talking about property taxes are killing communities, but these are the same communities who want to restrict having affordable housing built, that turn around and bring revenue back to their communities. So I believe we have to have a true partnership with the federal government, with our state government, and our local municipalities. We all need to put some skin in the game. And it will turn back. If number one, it will benefit our residents who live here, but it'll have a direct impact to property tax relief.
Yeah, and I want to have the last question here over to Doug, kind of picking up on Sheila's point. There are models of transit agencies in other parts of the world that actually own the land around the stations, develop the land. It could be market housing, market rate housing, could be ownership, could be rentership, you name it. Is there ever, and it's a big question to ask in the last 2 minutes, so we're not going to get at everything here. We'll have some follow-ups about this. But to Sheila's point, these partnerships, is there potential argument to have a little bit more of this crossover between some of these agencies and thinking about it more broadly? I mean, you know, Park New Haven manages a lot of the area right around New Haven, the Union Station. So is there potential appetite for that kind of development, you know, in Connecticut or with DOT or elsewhere?
That's a great question. What immediately comes to mind, I think SFMTA in San Francisco has been leading the way with building housing on their property and then having the revenues from that property go back into the operating side of the house. And it's really tough. We've had a very, you know, what's really hard is to keep operations running when we have very, you know, tumultuous funding environments here in Connecticut. Over the last decade, transit operations have been on the chopping block at least 4 or 5 times. I remember a period from like 2015 to 2018 where each year the Greater Bridgeport Transit District was being forced to come up with operation analysis and a plan for 50% cut in service. And again, when I mentioned earlier, that's 7,000 Housatonic Community College students that are no longer going to be seeing that. You know, in New Haven, we have, you know, I'll share just, I love sharing slides, obviously. I just talk from images. So, you know, here is an image of the opportunities and challenges around. In Union Station on the orange, we have the connector coming through. You know, Union Station owns its surface lots next to the property. And, you know, we did a planning exercise a while ago of what the property across from Union Station could look like. The concept in front of you was a 30% affordable concept. And from my perspective, the biggest element about this is this park in the middle of it, you know, at one point titled Union Square. If I had if I could go back and plan, this vehicular connection would just be an all pedestrian connection, but rotating it and putting it in perspective, you're seeing a fully built out area surrounding the train station, including more properties around Union Station. What we're going to be doing here in New Haven is going to be looking for private sector partners through a P3 public-private partnership. Look for the January or early in 2023 an RFQ to come out with an RFP to follow, shortlisting developers to work with us to give the development community an opportunity to give the state of Connecticut, City of New Haven, their best idea on what to build on these parcels. You know, one way that agencies do this is with ground leases, so 99-year ground leases that then have a lease payment back into the station. You know, for us, our parking surrounding the train station subsidizes the train station. Our parking used to net something like $3 million a year, and we would, you know, have the station, the costs at the station, you know, outweigh its revenue opportunities. And so, you know, the parking has always been subsidizing our train station operations in New Haven. And we think that also, you know, building buildings will also help that as well. And I just want to zoom in on what this what this plan said to do with regards to Union Square, one of the ways that Connecticut can now do these types of projects, advancing the infrastructure ahead of the housing, ahead of the work, is through a tax incremental financing, or a TIF district. TIF districts have to create some sort of revenue, and I think it's like $10 million of new taxable properties. This property would certainly generate that. But a lot of our conversations with development community and community partners in New Haven, as well as the state, a lot of our conversations on the campus side, the east side of Union Avenue, revolve around what's happening on the west side. And a lot of people think what happens on over around what is called Union Square in this map is going to really influence and back and forth the station. So on one hand, the station does not control across the street, but on the other, we really do think that the Union Square infrastructure programming will greatly benefit and enhance pedestrian access and the walkability for the Union Station district. And then I'll stop by saying we're not sure yet if what we will be doing at Union Station is a fee simple land transfer or asset sale, or if it will be a leaseback operation. But regardless of what we do, we're going to make sure that the properties surrounding Union Station that are on the campus side, that are state-owned presently, make sure that those properties are feeding into the system and have a unified wayfinding and messaging that is all being taken care of by the same maintenance team, so that we can guarantee when residents come to Union Station, they have a great environment.
Well, I think that's a really interesting and optimistic note to end on. And that's to say, again, we didn't get the bill passed this year, but there are some really interesting ideas percolating around in our communities, some of our cities, maybe not Stonington right now, but other towns are also thinking about TOCs as an opportunity to have creative kinds of development. We need local, state, federal involvement. We need public sector. We need private sector. There are a lot of folks that are being left out of some of these conversations that we're excited to be speaking for and with. So with that, I want to thank you, Sheila, for being here. I want to thank you, Doug, for being here. I want to thank everybody for participating. Apologize for running a little bit over. But I want to alert you too that Sheila mentioned this. We're going to be doing a lot of work locally this summer on these affordable housing plans that are due this next month. So please stay tuned for work on that. We will also be having another series of events on TOCs, on some of the other exciting work that we've got coming up with Desegregate CT, both in the coming legislature at the state level, but also a lot of great local work. So please do follow along on the website. Make sure you're signed up on our newsletter, which is at the bottom right of our website, and stay involved. We got a lot of really great things coming up, a lot of great people like Doug and Sheila, who we hope to have come back in these conversations. So thank you so much and have a good rest of your day.